I'm Ken. When I first started this channel, I told you how I was pushed into worldwide stamp collecting by starting a collection of World War I stamps that just blossomed into a full worldwide collection. I also promised that one day I'd share that collection with you, and well, today's the day. So, this is my World War I collection album. I'll open it up and let's take a look inside. I started this album when my US collecting slowed down. I'd gotten to the point where I was adding just a few stamps at a time to it, and short of spending money on more expensive individual stamps, I wasn't getting enough hobby fun out of it. I wanted to expand, but I didn't want to expand into collecting everything. So I picked this era to both limit my collection to a time period and a subset of countries. Silly me, this was just a gateway collection to a full-blown worldwide collection. Oh well, once I started accumulating stamps from my World War I album, I found I had stamps from many other countries and time periods. What was I going to do, throw the rest of them away? My first task on this was to define what I wanted in this collection. I decided on stamps from the time period of World War I, roughly 1914 to 1919, from countries that had participated in World War I. That's a poor definition indeed. By that definition, I'd be including US stamps from 1914, even though the US didn't enter the war until 1917. So first, I narrowed it down to the time period that each country was in the war. Still, it seemed to me that there was one more trick to getting this right. I couldn't just count stamps that were released while each country was in the war. I wanted stamps that were in use during the war, even on the first day of that country's participation. So I added that I would collect the regular issue stamps that were available when each country entered the war too. So it's an oddly complicated description, but it boils down to a simple idea: stamps that someone would have used while their country was in World War I. This map shows the major players in the war. It's from a book about World War I history available on Project Gutenberg. I've put a link to it in the notes below. Project Gutenberg deserves credit for their excellent work to make older books available online. There's a lot going on with this map, and this video isn't a history lesson, but still a little history is in order. The war started in 1914 when the Kingdom of Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, provoked by the assassination of Austria's Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the presumptive heir to the Austrian throne. This is Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Onenberg. Both were killed by a Serbian assassin with nationalist ties. This was just the justification that Austria-Hungary needed to declare war on the Kingdom of Serbia, a war they were itching to start anyway. So that puts the Austria-Hungary Empire and the Kingdom of Serbia at war. At the start of the war, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy were in a defensive alliance called the Triple Alliance, although Italy's support was weak. Germany, on the other hand, was itching for its own war both with Russia and France. Prior to declaring war on Serbia, Austria had pushed for assurances that Germany had its back from retaliatory threats from Russia. Russia was a major supporter of Serbia and was building its forces to come to Serbia's aid, possibly through Germany, a longtime enemy. Germany declared war on Russia 4 days later, adding the German Empire and the Russian Empire to the war. Russia, France, and Great Britain also had a defensive alliance called the Triple Entente. With Russia in the war, France and Great Britain were sure to join soon. Germany was worried it would struggle with a war on two fronts, so they preemptively declared war on France just 2 days later. The Germans hoped to sweep through Belgium, pushing France out of the conflict so they could focus with Austria on the threat from Russia. France was not the easy battle Germany had hoped for. Of course, the Kingdom of Belgium joined the war as Germany crossed them to get to France. That happened the very next day. Also that day, Great Britain declared war. And with Britain in the war, the entirety of the British Empire was drawn in, including Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland, which was then separate from Canada. In October, the Ottoman Empire entered the war, attacking Russia with German commanders and crews on newly acquired ships. The exact details of the Ottoman rationale for joining the war are too complex for this video, and perhaps even unclear to historians. Nor did the empire act as one. They had internal struggles at home, including both political and religious divisions, which led to the horror of the Armenian genocide. The Kingdom of Bulgaria entered the war in October of 1915 after trying to maintain neutrality for over a year. This rounded out the group of 4 countries known as the Central Powers of World War I. They would be the last country to join the conflict on the losing side. I've put together this list of countries that would join the Allied forces, truly a global response, and all with various reasons to take sides. During the middle of the war, the German war effort was suffering from lack of food and other resources. The Germans attacked U.S. ships, taking the risk that attacks on private shipping wouldn't draw the U.S. into the war before they could defeat Great Britain. That was a grave miscalculation. The U.S. entered the war in April of 1917, declaring war on the German Empire. In December, they also declared war on Austria-Hungary, although they never formally declared war against the Ottoman Empire or Bulgaria. U.S. troops arriving in Europe would tip the balance, resulting in the end of the war within a year. This was the Chicago Daily Tribune on the day of the German armistice. The other Central Powers had signed similar agreements over the previous 2 months. The terms of the end of the war would ultimately be settled with the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919. Enough history, though. You're here for the stamps. So with the context behind us, let's take a look at some stamps. These stamps were the definitive issues at the time Austria declared war on Serbia. The first and second stamps are an appeal to historical legitimacy featuring King Karl VI, who was the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of Austria in 1711, and his daughter Maria Theresa, who became Holy Roman Empress, ruler of Austria and Queen of Hungary in 1740 after her father's passing. Many of the other stamps feature the reigning monarch Franz Joseph. While Austria-Hungary was the empire, both Austria and Hungary were independent countries, with Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, and the King of Hungary. Both countries issued independent postage, so all these stamps were from Austria proper. There was an intermediate issue before these that honored the birthday jubilee of Franz Joseph, but I generally lean away from collecting commemorative stamps. Looking forward at my other choices for this album, I should probably make a page for those jubilee stamps. The stamps on this page were issued starting in 1916 during the war. They feature the emperor, crowns, and coats of arms. With the death of Franz Joseph in 1916, Karl I would become emperor, the last one of the empire. The natural line of succession had been broken with the death of Franz Joseph's only son. After that, the presumptive successor had been Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination had been the presumptive start of the war. These stamps feature Karl. I'm showing all 4 of the stamps. I've also put the first semi-postal stamps from Austria on this page. I just have 2 examples of those, and I've left room for the first airmail stamps here too, although I don't have any of those yet. Note that the first airmail stamps came out during World War I. The war effort pushed forward advances in air power, contributing to the beginning of airmail. The first ever airmail stamp was this 24-cent U.S. Curtis Jenny stamp that's so famous for its inverted issue. It came out in 1918, the same year as the first Austrian airmail stamps. These stamps were used in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The area was occupied by Austria during the war. The stamps on this page are mostly the regular issues, but these stamps also exist with a Feldpost overprint for military use, and a Feldpost inscribed version that I have just one of. There are also versions of these stamps with a single number for the denomination along the bottom. These are inscribed Militarpost. I don't have copies of those stamps yet. Following the death of Franz Joseph, this series featuring Emperor Karl was issued. They came out with the Militarpost inscription for general use and the Feldpost inscription, like I have here, for military use, a little confusing. This page shows various semi-postal stamps from Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war. It includes this stamp featuring Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie that we noted earlier. Finally, this page is for the stamps of Austria issued during their occupation of Italy. I haven't bought the mounts for these yet. Italy had tried to stay neutral but entered the war on the side of the Allies in 1915. These were issued in the Austrian-occupied territories in 1918 near the end of the war. I've put these stamps here in the Austrian section because they were issued by Austria. I could have chosen to put them in the Italy section. I haven't been consistent with those choices through this album. Oh well. Moving on to Hungary. These were the regular issues at the start of the war. Actually, these stamps had existed in various forms since 1900, but these issues are the first to use the double cross watermark. I haven't included any of the older stamps on this page. Notice that the higher value stamps show Franz Joseph. He was also the King of Hungary. Those stamps on the bottom row are semi-postal stamps. overprinted with a 2 filler surcharge that went to support war widows and orphans. There was also a taller format semi-postal stamp that originally went to aid flood victims before the war. I've included them here not because they're part of the World War I page, but because they are the base stamp for another overprint that also went to war widows and orphans. I don't have any of those yet. Next we have the harvesting and parliament building stamps, with the smaller sized harvesting stamps for the lower values, and the wide format parliament building stamps for the higher values. Notice the bottom row of 2. These stamps came out first in the set. They have numbers with a colored background. There are only 2 of these. These stamps, along with all the other denominations, were reissued with the color pattern reversed. It's easy to see once you know to look for them. All these stamps were also issued overprinted like this. This overprint, don't make me try to pronounce it, means Republic of. These were issued at the end of the war, after the monarchy was dissolved. Notice the first and second stamps say Magyar Kier Posta. The Kier means royal, and there were no more royalty. Finally, that 4th version of the stamp changes the inscription to simply Magyar Posta, omitting the Kier. It's a subtle but important change. Finally, this page sweeps up a few extra wartime issues. The first row, which I don't have yet, is a crown-style stamp. The second shows the king, King Carl I. Actually, in Hungary he was known as King Charles IV, but it's the same guy. There are also 2 denominations featuring his wife, Queen Zita. Again, you'll see Republic overprint versions of these stamps. Finally, I have 3 semi-postal stamps and their Republic versions, well, almost all of them. I don't know where the charity for these went, but I assume it also went to war widows and orphans. Notice that on this page the album paper color changes from gray to cream. We've moved to Serbia. I've used gray paper for the Central Powers and cream paper for the Allied Powers. There are 3 series on this page. The first features King Peter I. The second is a wide format stamp that shows King Peter with his staff. These are technically not postage stamps. They were printed but never released as postage. Instead, these were released as emergency currency. I don't have any of these. This is a very odd thing in the Scott catalog, and it's not the only place that this happens. Scott gives these regular catalog numbers, even though they were never used as postage. What's a collector to do? If you collect postage stamps, you might skip these. But if you collect all the Scott catalog numbers, you have a decision to make. It's a case of the catalog driving collecting styles. So odd. The final series is an image of Peter with his son, Prince Alexander. After the war, Serbia, which had already combined with Montenegro, would unite with Croatia, Bosnia, and Slovenia under Alexander's leadership to form the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. This earned him the nickname Alexander the Unifier. This page will hold stamps from Bosnia and Herzegovina, overprinted with Serbian. I don't have any examples to show you. These stamps were issued by Austria in occupied areas of Serbia starting in 1916. There is a version with diagonal overprints and a version with horizontal overprints. Notice that I've put these occupier stamps here under Serbia, unlike the Italian stamps which I put under Austria. Like I said, I'm just not consistent. This first page from Russia has stamps from the Russian Empire. This series is the regular issues available at that time. The only one of these stamps I have is this 7 kopeck stamp featuring Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. That second strip of stamps is for stamps, well, not really stamps. These were issued as paper money also, another place where Scott lists non-postage stamps as a stamp. These have inscriptions on the back saying that they are equivalent to silver coins. Anyway, despite being issued as paper money, they occasionally found their use onto mail, so maybe Scott has this one right, it's hard to tell. Postally used stamps are worth a small premium on what's listed in the catalog. Finally, on the third strip, I have one example of a surcharge stamp. This one is the same 7 kopeck stamp, surcharged to 10 kopecks. When Russia entered the war, they were an empire, but during the war, the Russian Revolution happened and Russia became a socialist republic. These stamps were released by the provisional government during their civil war. They took existing stocks of stamps and overlaid them with a varnish of diamond shapes. I wish I could show you what that looks like, but that effect is difficult to see even in person. This final page of Russian stamps are from the period after the Russian Civil War. Those first two stamps show a motif of a sword severing the chain of bondage. Also on this page are a series of semi-postal stamps to support various war charities. These stamps were issued before the Civil War. There are 3 versions of each of the 4 stamps. The first 2 are different perforations. The third is on white instead of toned paper. These are the Germania issues that were in use during the war. Of course, there are other Germania issues before these and afterwards. I want to remind you of the strength and peace emblems on this stamp. Germania holding both a sword and an olive branch. This was the symbolism of the time in a period that had been leading to a conflict that seems almost inevitable. We've talked about these stamps enough in other videos. These are stamps issued in German-occupied Lithuania, the same Germania stamps overprinted Postgebiet ob Ost, Ost being German for East. These were issued on the eastern front of the German lines into Russia, that is Lithuania. These are similar overprints for Poland and Warsaw. Interestingly, during World War I, Bavaria was still a kingdom, while also being part of the German Empire, but as such they issued their own postage stamps. These stamps are of their king at the time, King Ludwig III. This is a page for these German East Africa stamps. I have this one in my Germany collection, but not a duplicate in this album yet. That's a funny thing about these topical collections. I need 2 copies of some stamps. One for my country album and one for the topical album. I could put pointers in one of the albums, but that didn't seem like the best solution for me. Anyway, Germany occupied a number of African and island territories at the start of the war. Nothing unique here, it was something all the empires did at the time. Germany used stamps featuring this ship, the Kaiser's yacht, in many of those territories. We'll see more of these later. The World War was fought on these fronts too, with territories of Britain, Belgium, and Portugal fighting against the Germans in East Africa. The German strategy was to deflect resources to Africa that might otherwise support attacks in Europe. German East Africa would be split among the Allied forces to become British Tanganyika and Kenya, Belgian Rwanda, Burundi, and Portuguese Mozambique. This page has Belgian Congo stamps overprinted for use in Belgian-occupied areas of German East Africa. And these are the stamps of British East Africa and Uganda overprinted with GEA for use in areas they occupied. There are other stamps from Nyasaland overprinted NF, but I don't have any of those in my collection yet. These are stamps from German New Guinea featuring the same yacht stamp. None of these are actually wartime issues. The first line has stamps reissued and sold only in Berlin. The second line has issues that were only used before the war. They're decent space fillers for now. This page and the next 2 are for Australian occupation stamps of German New Guinea. The first page is for the German yacht stamps overprinted GRI. The second page is for the stamps of Australia overprinted NW Pacific Islands. And this last page is for British issues overprinted Nauru. Nauru was under the jurisdiction of German New Guinea. Another set of German yacht stamps, this time for the German Southwest Africa. This is what is now modern Namibia. France was not an empire at the start of the war. It was one of the few republics among the combatants. These early sewer stamps were the postage of the day. Although there are many other sewer stamps, the others came out after the war. I have 3 other pages for French stamps, but nothing to show there. There are some early semi-postal stamps, some French military stamps overprinted FM, and German occupation stamps, Germania stamps surcharged with French denominations. And now Great Britain comes to support France and Russia. The smaller stamps on this page are King George V stamps that were in use during the war. In particular, these are the earlier watermark types for these stamps. There were other printers and watermarks after the war. These larger stamps are the higher value seahorse stamps. They are some of my favorite designs from Great Britain. And with Great Britain comes the entire British Empire. These were the King George V stamps used in Canada. Australia had these King George V stamps. Are you starting to see a pattern? India also had King George V stamps. There were also versions of these stamps overprinted IEF for military use by the Indian Expeditionary Force, as well as versions overprinted by the various Indian states. This first strip of stamps for New Zealand features King Edward VII, plus that one pence commerce stamp. These were the stamps in use in New Zealand at the start of the war. They wouldn't issue their own George V stamps until 1915, 4 years into his reign. But indeed, there he is, on the second strip, King George V. Newfoundland was still separate from Canada during the war. There's King George on the 2-cent stamp there. The first stamp features Queen Mary. This whole series features various members of the royal family rather than just repetitive denominations all featuring the king. Good for them. Last but not least for the British Empire, here's South Africa, all King George for them. Belgium was issuing these stamps with tabs at the beginning of the war. These tabs directed the post office not to deliver the stamped letter on a Sunday. A person could rip off the tab before mailing their letter to indicate that Sunday delivery was okay. These tabs are fragile and really hard to collect intact. A real pain in the neck, in my opinion. Those stamps on the bottom strip are of Belgian King Albert I. Stamps with nearly identical designs go on the first line too. Scott lists them as having smaller heads, which is true, although it's a little hard to notice. I think it's easier to notice the 2 little squares in the upper corners of the portrait. The second and third stamps are the larger head versions, no squares on the top corners. The one in the middle has the engraver's name, Edward Pellins, near the perforations above the little tab. The one on the right is missing the engraver's name. This is a page for semi-postal stamps from the same time. I don't have any of those yet. The next series from Belgium left out the little tabs, but still had a design with King Albert. The higher denominations included pictorial issues. And finally, this page has the stamps Germany issued for occupied Belgium. They're Germania overprints with Belgian currency. I like them here with Belgium rather than in the German section. I don't have stamps for this page yet. I have some Montenegro issues from before the war. After the war, Montenegro joined with Serbia as it and other countries merged towards becoming Yugoslavia. This page is set up for 2 series of stamps, one featuring King Nicholas I and the other featuring Austrian military stamps overprinted for use during their occupation of Montenegro. Japan was an ally during the war and fought to take German territories in China and Micronesia, particularly the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands. Japanese postage was used on those islands during and after the war, so there aren't any special issues for that period. I have 9 pages of stamps for the Ottoman Empire during this period. So far I have just 9 stamps across all these pages. I think these stamps are quite lovely, unlike anything the West was putting out. Unfortunately, I have very little understanding of them since I can't read the letters and numbers on them without looking them up. I'm excited to expand this area in my collection. I've barely made a dent in my Italian collection either. Most of the stamps on this page feature King Victor Emmanuel III. Other pages, which are empty so I'll skip them, include semi-postal stamps, the first Italian airmail stamps, and Italian occupation of Austria stamps. Remember, I had some Austrian occupation of Italy stamps in the Austria section. I'm still not sure if I've sorted things most optimally for this album. And this is the page I have for Bulgaria. These stamps remind me of the stamps of its neighbor to the south, the Ottoman Empire. Modern Bulgaria issued an abusive number of cancelled-to-order stamps, which I don't care for, but these earlier issues are quite nice, another area of my collection that I'm looking forward to expanding. Portugal entered the conflict in 1916. These were the stamps that were in use there at the time. There are many other denominations issued after the war. Romania, sitting between Austria and Bulgaria on 2 sides, and between Serbia and Russia on the other 2, tried to remain neutral for the first 2 years of the war. In 1916, they joined the battle on the side of the Allies, until they were occupied by Austria. After Austria signed their armistice, Romania re-entered the war with Germany for 1 day before Germany surrendered, after which Romania turned its attention on the newly independent Hungary for the short Hungaria-Romania War, which was not technically considered part of World War I. This page features stamps of King Carol I. I have a second empty page for pictorial issues in use at the start of the war, as well as another empty page for occupation issues from Austria, Bulgaria, and Germany. The Washington Franklin stamps were the issues in use by the U.S. during the war. There's no need to cover these in any more detail than we have in the past. I've put this page in sort of as a placeholder. That stamp is a U.S. victory issue. It shows a woman personifying victory in front of the flags of the Allies. U.S. in the center. It is a U.S. stamp after all. Great Britain, Belgium, Serbia, and France. Although it could be France, then Belgium, since the design isn't in color and you can't tell what color the stripes are on those flags. Russia was left off this stamp possibly because of the activities happening around the Russian Revolution. My intent is to add the various victory stamps, and early airmail stamps to this album, but I haven't really fleshed that out yet. I've put 2 covers on this page. The first is a stampless cover from a soldier to his home. U.S. soldiers overseas weren't required to pay postage for letters home. I think that flag cancel is amazing. Also notice the blue censor stamp. This is a really wonderful cover. The second cover is a postcard to a soldier at Camp Hancock in Georgia. It's dated August 10th, 1918, and reads, "Bobby, I helped with the grain in Daddy's place this morning. The men said I was not a slacker. Have 2 blisters but feel fine. Love, B." This little slice of life makes me wonder about so many things. With the U.S. in the war, along came Alaska, Hawaii, they weren't states yet, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Only the Philippines had their own postage stamps at the time. Something about that orange Lincoln stamp is really wonderful to me. This is my first page of Greek stamps. These were the issues available at the start of the war. Notice the stamps on the bottom strip. That's a monogram of intertwined E and T under a crown. It stood for Greek Post. Greece's entry into the war led to a schism in the country, with the prime minister setting up a provisional government in the north. These overprint stamps were for use in crown loyalist regions in the central and southern parts of Greece. The provisional government in the north issued their own stamps during the war, although I don't have any of these yet. Finally, Greece issued various postal tax stamps related to the war effort. I don't have any of those yet either. Brazil was the last Allied country to enter the war. They had tried to stay neutral, but German submarines kept sinking their supply ships. These are the Brazilian stamps available during the war. And with that, we're done with the stamps. I really enjoyed making this album. I learned a lot in the process. Particularly, I learned a lot about World War I and the history of that era. But a few other things jumped out at me as I was making this album. One of the things that jumped out at me is how printing processes changed in the border between when World War I was happening till the end. During World War I, most stamps in the world were made using an engraving process. But after World War I, we moved to a lithography process in general. Stamps just look different before and after the war, and that's in part because of the typical printing processes and improvements in technology that happened during the war. This was also the dawn of commemorative stamps. There was a lot to commemorate after the war, and once countries got a taste for the commemorative postage, they all dove into it with vigor. This was also the transition of the world from empires and monarchies into republics. The Austria-Hungary Empire dissolved, with both monarchies becoming republics. Germany was an empire that became a republic. The Ottoman Empire dissolved, becoming most obviously Turkey, but also included countries that are now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, large parts of Saudi Arabia, and both Israel and Palestinian territories. On the Allied side, even though the British Empire would remain, the Russian Empire, as a result of their civil war, dissolved into a republic, and Greece would shortly go from being a kingdom to being a republic itself. The other big change was the advent of airmail. The war brought significant improvements in airplane technology, and it trained a lot of pilots, paving the way for faster postal delivery using airmail. Over 17 million people died during this war. I think it's really important that we remember that during this video. I've learned a lot about the horror of that time putting together this album and putting this video together. I hope you've learned something too while you've watched.